We are now on Lameches Beis, and the Gemara is quoting Rabbi Abba's answer to the question of the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael regarding Bittul Barov and why in our Mishnah Bittul Barov doesn't apply, and the ingredients which were lent by Rachel to Leah. Rachel owns the, shall we say, the salt and the water and the spices. Why are those ingredients not butter? And in order to answer this question, Rabbi Abba offers an analogy, an analogous case, what he thinks is a good analogy. Is Yochel Halah V'chadi? Would it be so that if, let's say, Rachel, in this case, had given a certain volume, we'll call it a kav of chitin, and she gave it over to Leah. Leah has a Sarah kav, 10 times that amount of chitin. Does that mean, therefore, that Leah, because she has 10 kavim, the rove, she can now acquire ownership, so to speak, over the kav of Rachel, the kav chitim of Rachel, and eat the entire mixture? For sure not. In Lomar, we're not going to say that we activate the principle of Bittul Barov, and therefore she, Leah, the Balas Harov of Rov Chitin, is now Zocha. She now acquires ownership over the 1/10, meaning the 1 kav of Chitin that belonged to Rachel. And certainly there's no svara here also. With regard to Tchumen, everything depends upon the Shem Bailim. And you can't ask me that there should be a bittul of the Shem Bailim of Leah vis-a-vis her ownership of the Mayim, the Chitim, the Mayim, and the Tavlin, and the Melach. She is still a Balas Dover. She's still a Bailim of it. The Shem Bailim doesn't change by virtue of a din of Rov. And the response that he got, he started laughing. Amalahu, so the Abba said, why are you laughing at me? Did I take your garment and you're laughing? What did I say? What did I do that's stupid? And again they started laughing. And later on, we're going to see each time, we're trying to explain each time why round after round they laughed at it. But in any event, the reason why the Gemara is telling us all this background information, these details about the laughing, is because Lonis Kabbalah tefillah, and his tefillah they should laugh at it was not accepted on high. And the Shas, the Gemara wants to teach us that maybe his tefillah was inappropriate. He shouldn't have said, I hope they'll accept my Torah. He should have said, I hope that we'll get the emes, the emes, the truth of Torah. So the tefillah of Rabbi Abba is being criticized in this underlying theme, but that's not so relevant to us. Amar Lahu, Amar Rav Oshia. Rav Oshia is now going to explain why Rabbi Abba was laughed out of the base Shomi. They did the right thing by laughing at him. Because look at the analogy carefully of Rabbi Abba. He compares it to a kav chitin that got mixed up with a sarah kav chitin b'siorim to lokam. It seems that clearly Rabbi Abba chose what's called the tarobas of min b'mina. He did not mention a case where, let's say, a Rachel owned a kav of siorim and Leah a kav of chitim, and there was a mixture of the two. Rabbi Abba, by indicating that Rov should not apply here, and that was his objection to the Chachamim, who thought that logically Rov and Bittul Barov should apply here, he didn't give an example of chitim that got mixed up with siorim. For sure, the reason he did not give that example, he was deliberate about an example of chitim b'chitim, which means bin b'mina, is because Rabbi Abba indeed was of the opinion that in the case of min, had it been a mixture of chitim and slorin, then there would be bit. Which means that Rabbi Abba seems to be waving the flag of Rabbi Yehuda that min b'mino afilu bi elef lo bottom. And the Gemara understood that Rabbi Abba's approach and his logic was based on the universal halachas of tarovis, of bit, distinguishing as it were between min b'mino and min b'sheino. Now, again, we should ask the question, why is melach and tavlin and mayim, why is that considered min b'mino in the analogy of Rabbi Abba to chitin b'chitin? And we're going to have to operate with the premise that anything that is normally put into the tarovis, when you make an Isa, these are elements, ingredients that she needs, and every balabasta who's making that Isa would need that and add those ingredients. Therefore, it's considered min b'mino in the analogy of Rabbi. However, Rabbi Abba holds that after min shenis arib b'sheino mino would be bottle, but min b'mino is not bottle. So the Chachamim laughed at him. Why? Because the halacha would be Eshev lehem dafka b'dugma shel miut chitim shenis arib v'rov chitim. In Rabbi Abba's choice, deliberate of chitim b'chitim, that the miut chitim that's arib, because had it been a miut chitim that was nisarib b'rov sa'orin, we gave the opposite case, then Rabbi Abba would certainly say that our premise, the premise of the Chachmir, would be correct. It would apply. And this is not so. Because if bittul doesn't apply in min b'mino, it won't apply in min b'sheino either. If there's some fundamental reason like, bilim, you can't steal something from someone else based on bittul. And chita b'chita nine, chita Rabbi Yehuda lo batel, Rabbanan miftal batel. The distinction here between min b'mino, min b'sheino, if Rabbi Abba's example was bedafka of chita b'chita, is only meaningful according to the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. By the way, Rabbi Yehuda appears in Menachos Chav Beis, but in many places in Shas and Yuma as well, that min b'mino and bottle. But Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. We pass like the Chachamim that min b'mino is bottle. So that if Rabbi Abba wanted to respond by saying that within the context of Tchumen and that Mishnah, Mayim Melach, etc., should not be bottle, even though they're the mute, because the Isa is the robe, but nevertheless there is no bittul because we're talking about Shem Bailam, is then, according to the Chachamim, min b'mino should be exactly the same as min b'sheino mino, because Rabbanan never accepted that distinction of Rabbi Yehuda between min b'mino and min b'sheino mino. So then, since Rabbi Abba, you agree that in min b'sheino mino there would be bittul, then according to the Chacham of Rabbi Yehuda, in min b'mino there should be bittul. Hence, we go a full circle back to the question of the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael. The situation here, even if I grant you that it's min b'mino with regard to the Melech and the Mayim, should be one of bittul. That was the question. Amalei Rav Tzaf turns to Rav Ochia, Moshe, which is a lashon shapir ka'amrit. Are you saying something that's sound and reasonable to reject the response of Rabbi Abba, and you're justifying the Chachamim who laughed at Rabbi Abba? Lo Shamile, did you not hear about Rabbi Chia? Meaning the statement and the ruling of Rabbi Chia. Oh, the Omar, Rabbi Chia, he came from Kostova, Shrei the Rav, in the name of Rav, Haborer Tzroros Migrono Shel Chavero, Chayav L'Shalom Lo Tmei Chita. If, let's say, excuse me, if Ruvain owns Chita in his Goren, and there are pebbles mixed in. They take up a certain volume. And Reuven wants to sell Lomazog, and he wants to sell this volume of chit. Comes along Shimon, and he thinks he's a good Samaritan, and he removes the tzoros, the stones, from this mixture, from the chit. Says Rabbi Chia, the neighbor of Rav, why? Because when I sell you something by value, then we don't subtract the tzoros. The tzoros have to take up volume. I sell you the whole package deal, and you'll get what's inside of it. Even though it's tzoros, you as a buyer wanted to get pure chita, but it's known and accepted in the marketplace that you'll get a certain volume of chita, of tzoros mixed in, of psolos mixed into the ochel. Is kevin shahotzi tzoros. Now that Shimon took out and removed the tzoros of the chitim of Reuven and thinking he's doing him a good favor, but he actually causes a hefsed because there was a certain element of the tzoros, the volume of the tzoros, that jacked up the price. Now you remove the tzoros and the weight and the volume has gone down. The mocher, meaning the owner of these people, take a financial loss. Almo, we see from this that kila chasra, that even by removing from the chita something that's worthless, kila, nevertheless he has to pay for it. Why? Because that is worth something for the balachim who's selling his chita, because otherwise, if you remove the tzoros, he's going to have to fill in with more chita. He doesn't want to give more chita at the same price, at the same value. Achinami. Here too, by analogy, kila chas in our Mishnah, in the case of mayim melach, which we need for the Isa, they give time to the Isa, so therefore Leah borrowed it from them because she knows that she has to enhance her Isa by adding avlin, mayim, and melach. Therefore, kolshkein, there should not be any bittul. And that's exactly the Abba's point over here, says Rav Sa. Meaning, I don't understand, Rav Moshe, why you justify the Chachmi's response of laughing. Rabbi Abba added the ball. On the contrary, the response of Rabbi Abba is based on sound logic by virtue of this analogy, equation to Rabbi Chia in the case of Borat Tzroros, that in our Mishnah, even though you might say, in our Mishnah, we equate it to Tzroros, and Tzroros is worth something to the violent. Here also, in the case of Mayim and Melech, that's worth something to the violent. It's not lost in its significance. There's no bittul barov here. So therefore, our Mishnah, says Rabbi Abba, in light of this explanation of Tafa and the analogy here, is very well justified. We understand why we don't say bittul barov as far as Melech and Mayim are concerned in this Isa. The Tzoros are not batel, non-existent, so too the Mayim. See, he says in the bottom, in the footnote, that Iker Kavanot Rabbi Abba, according to this interpretation of Chia, is Kedei Lochia Shabailus Mominus Eina B'Teilu Barov. He just wants to point out that there's no bittul barov here as far as ownership in the same Bible. That shouldn't be taken literally as chitim b'chitim. Elahu adin gam chitim b'si oren. Vatam she'utzaf Rabbi Ava, Rabbi Sachar, is divrei Rabbi Chia, lo omar takshem mipnei habailus hamonis edim b'teilu barov. Even she came, you mock a moment, Shabaim, Vamelch, and Shovim, Yak, Momon Mua, the Adam Hashubi's battle, Avia Maima, Vinyan aboard Soros, Shomatsinu, Bishat Soros, Adam Uma, Mikomakom Hashum, a moment, Lachayaval. They have something that in and of itself is not really worth much, and that should certainly apply to the case of sorrows. And nevertheless, we say that it's considered mammon, and you have to pay the mammon because those sorrows represent something of value insofar as there's a value within the chita. And so to here, we should also apply that same logic that there's no bittul barov in terms of pilots mammon, because the Ma'im and the Mela, even if they're not worth much and they're not chachim, they won't be bittul barov. Just like the Toros, even though they're not worth much, are not bittul. So Abai responds to Rav Safa, and it's interesting because the original discussion was between Rav Safa and Rav Oshia. Now Abai jumps into the picture, and he asks Rav Safa, how could you defend Rabbi Abba with the words and the ruling of Rabbi Chia? No, that's not going to justify our, because Lo Shani Le'mar, aren't you going to make a distinction? A moment she ate token, the moment she ain't lo. In the case of Tzoros, the Bored Tzoros, Migron Shal Chavero, there the Balachitim wants to be Tovea, he wants to litigate and sue the Bored Tzoros for damages on what he was opposite. So therefore the Tzoros are not bought. He really has a good claim against the Bored Tzoros for causing him a financial loss. But in a case where this moment she'ein l'bayla tovim, they have no claim. For example, in our Mishnah, where let's say Rachel lent Leah Mayim and Melach for that day of Yontif, that's called moment she'ein l'tovim. That day of Yontif, at least, she is not asking and demanding back the money, the insignificant Mayim and Melach, and therefore, ein la be'isa din mom. She Rachel, the owner of the Mayim and Melach, it's no din momini. The whole discussion is all about the Isur Shvisa. And if that be the case, then on Yom itself, Mayim and Melach have no chashivas at moment at all. And they should be bought in the East. Again, we go back to the objection of the Chachamim, the question that they raised with regard to the Mishnah, that it should be bittul of Mayim and Melach in the row. And this is because we don't introduce the element, the variable of Mammon in the case of Mammon Chain Lo Tovim, because once Rachel gave over the Mayim and the Melach to Leah, she basically was saying, Leah, you take over this Mayim and Melach, use it for your Isa, for your purposes, I'm out of here. She removes her shame Mammon. Case that the Bittul should apply. And we're stuck with Kashan and Amalei responds to Abai. And he says that Bittul Barov depends upon whether there's Bailam or not. But the Omer of Chizda, wait, this Ita of Rav Chizda with regard to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds in a Bittul Barov, that only applies if the Mitzius, the Rov that's being Mavat, has the same status as the Miut that's being Misbata. And that's called Sharov Hamavatal Yedino Shove, has the same din as the Miut Hamizbata. In a case where it cannot be Kemotzo, we'll emphasize that word Kemotzo, then that's like Min B'She'eno Mino, and even Rabbi Yehuda accepts Bittul Barov, even though technically, or in the physical world, the world of physics, you have Min B'Mino, but it's considered, according to Rabbi Yehuda, says Rabbi Chizda, Min B'She'eno Mino, and there would be Bittul. Because Min B'Mino only applies when it could be Kemosa. Example, says Rabbi Chizda, Nevela B'Tela B'Shchuta. Now here we have to know a little bit about Tuma V'Tara. An animal that chops dead without shchita, its carcass is Mitami Tumas Nevela. A shchuta is tahora. If you shake the animal, then the carcass is tahora. Now, here we have a case of a mixture of a piece of B'sar Nevela in many, many pieces of B'sar Shkuta. And the Nevela is Batal Barov, which means that if a person's tar would come in contact and touch one of these chatichos, he remains tar. He's not nit because of this din of Batal. And that applies even according to Rabbi Yehuda. There is bittul. Even again, in physical reality, it's min b'mina. It's basar and basar. I mean, there's no difference in terms of the physicality between shkuta and nevela. And yet, Rabbi Yehuda would agree, says Rabbi Beitza, that there is bittul barov. Why? Lefi she'i efshal l'shkuta shetei ase nevela, which means that the shkuta in itself, no matter how much time you wait, even if the flesh, the basar, starts deteriorating and smelling, nevertheless it remains tahora. And in such a case, we would not call it min b'mina because it's not kemos. Nevela loses its status as mea with the passage of time. And the reason for that is because it loses its shem ochel once it's spoiled. So therefore, since there's a fundamental difference in din, not in the physical reality of the matter, between a shchuta and a vela, therefore, even Rabbi Yehuda would say this is like a case of bin b'che'eno min, and it's batal barov. That's why if a tahar touches this mixture, since it's robe shchuta, he does not contract to it. But in the case of shchuta, ena b'tela b'nevela, let's say you have basar shchuta that falls into nevela. So you have a chatichas basar shchuta and many, many pieces of nevela, basar nevela. It's not going to be batal barov, which means that if a tar touches it, then he is in a state of tumah, at least. Again, that's a point over here that Rashi makes over here that it's suffix, because it means if he touches truma, then we're not going to burn the truma. That's always your criterion to determine whether you're in suffix or not. We don't burn truma if it's suffix nitma. Now, why is it that the chaticha shchuta is not b'tela barov? We just finished saying that the shchuta is mevatel the nevela in the case of nevela b'tela b'shchuta. What about the other way around? Shchuta, why is it not b'tela b'nevela? The answer is l'fisha efshel nevela shetiyasa shchuta. Because in this case, it's min b'mino, and Rabbi Yehuda holds min b'mino and a bat. Now, why is this min b'mino? Because halachically it's min b'mino, because the nevela can become shchuta. It means it can have the same halachic status as shchuta vis-a-vis tumah v'tara. If it's masriya and it's not roy lachiyu, it's not considered nevela and it's not mitameh. We see that there's a possibility that the nevela could revert back to its state of tara of like a shchuta, and therefore it's min b'mino, and therefore it's not batal barov. So now we're going to be understanding the kasha that Rav Safra wants to raise against Abaye. Abaye said that the din of Bintul Barov depends upon whether there's Bailim or not Bailim. How, asks Rav Safra, you can explain Rav Chiz. Why? Because according to you, Abaye, the din of Bintul Barov depends on whether there's Bailim or not Bailim, is Hachanami. Here too, in the case of the tarovas of nevela and shchuta, if he is like bailim lo bakli, if the nevela is owned by some bailim, are you going to tell me that it's not betela? That's certainly not so. Nevela is always betela amongst shchutos because it's considered, as we said before, min v'she'eno mina. So muchach bikan she'im yesh bitul barov ein adav tolim yesh lo bailim. The element, the variable of bilis is irrelevant. The halacha bitul barov does not depend and is not reflected by the variable of bilis. And we see that clearly from the case of nevela that got mixed up with shchuta, and the rov again is shchuta, that the nevela is betela barov, and the nogea is not even a subject to it. And it's irrelevant to whether or not the nevela has a separate bilim or doesn't. And so too in our mission as well. We're not going to apply the principle of bitul barov because, and that's really Abba's main point in explaining and justifying our mission, because it's a din mama. He says here in Cain b'mishnah she'ein omrim bitul barov mipnei shu din mamoni lo yishtana din machmash mamon she'ein lo tovim. That's your point, Abaye, that once Rachel lent the Mayim and the Melech to Leah for the purpose of the Isa of Yom, so for that Yom, he's not being Toveh any mamon. That's irrelevant, is Rav Sa. Moment she'ein lo tovim is irrelevant. And if you'll argue, maybe that's the din, that if the nevela has a pilot, then it's not Taylor Barov. And if in a mission where it's moment she'ein lo tovim, if the din should have been that it's Batal Barov, Tanya, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Heftzei Hefker Konim Shvisa. If you have an object that's ownerless, then if somebody on Yontif picks up that object, he finds it, he picks it up, then he could carry it alpayim amma in each direction. Afal pishein lo bailim, even though there's no ownership. Why? Because domim ishi yesh lem bailim is considered similar to yesh lem bailim, and it has a shvisa. So we see clearly it's absolutely mucha that even though it doesn't have bailim, but it doesn't lose its cheshivah as far as the Tchumen is concerned. If we understand our mission, as Rabbi Abba put it, that we're not going to say Bidla Amayim Vamela, even though, as Abai pointed out, it's Mom Shein Lotov, it's not going to be Bata. And the svara of Rabbi Abba is absolutely correct, because we see from Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Heftzei Hefker Edom Konin, and the person who finds this Hefker has Alpayim Amma in every single direction, even though it's Ein Lo Bayim. Amalei Sabai responser of Sakra, you want to make an equation between Dine Isur of our mission and Dine Hefsei Mom. They're fundamentally different. Isura, as far as the Din of Isur Heter is concerned, but there is a bittul. The mir is bottle in the row, but Mamona, Didi Mom is slow bottle. Ain't a mir bottle row. It nikna Mamona Mutal. Amua, Tlebala Momo, Namaruba. Lakshe Hicks, Achne Eretz Yisrael, Shei Bittul Baro. Ain't a Kavana Lahafsid Leisha Hamach Elis, right? That's Rachel who owns the salt and the water, Es Balus Alamayim Vamel Sheshila. They're not talking about that. They're talking about the din of Isuk Chumen, of the Balus Mayim and Mela. And therefore the din of Bittul should apply, should be active. The Kabul Mai Velach is Dinat Chumin Shal Palasay should be bought. Gemara asks the time of. So what's the reason that we don't say that the Maim and the Melech should be bottled in Isa? Abai Omer Matas Isa, Zerishem Atamat Tasa Isha Shufis, and Rav Omar Tavlin Lataima Bidi Vitaima Lo. Here we have a machlokes between Abai and Rava about the reasoning why there's no bittul barov. Abai says, Sarah, Shematata Isa B'Shut. In other words, they'll make a mistake. Yitu Loma, what's the tolos that we're afraid of? Shetolach Kol Ach. In the case of Isa B'Shut, Es ha'isa lefi makom shallah, because they would equate it with our case of balas ha'isa, right? That she could be molechet based on her tchum, even though this shutfis here, the balas mayim umela. They don't know that there's a distinction. Dafka here they were matir because of bittul berov, and in a case where there was no bittul berov, like an equal shutfis of the isa, they're going to think this din is the same, and each one of the shutfos is going to think that she can go kiraglel. So the Rabbanu made exera here in the din of our mission that the din of that isa should be like equivalent to the din of an isa sashutfim when each one has a shutfis, and therefore it's kiragle shtei. And that's the only way of answering, according to Abaye, the question that was raised, the objection of the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael, who, according to Abaye, are absolutely correct in assuming that here, in this case, there should be bittul. And let's go over again the logic here, because Mikom Adam is Isur L'Mamona, Isurei Batel. We classify and define Tchumen as Isur V'Heter, and therefore it's Batel. But Mammon is not Batel. Rava Omar, and Rava gives another example because you have something that gives Tam into a Taroves, and it's not Batel. Now turning to Daf Lamites, Rav Ashi Omar, he gives another answer why we don't apply Bittul of Melech and Mayim in the Isa. We should have since after Yontif, it will be mutter dovashesh matin afilu be'elef lo bot. Dovashenesa v'yeshars lahenos mimenu yosa hano v'ofen shel heter. The af is not bot. The af isazu nita liochla v'ofen shel heter. Kigon sheochlenu b'mkoma. No, you can eat it in that makom. Below lahotzia michutz l'tchum o yamtin ad liacher Yontif. So that's called Dover Sheish. Now the Mishnah says Rabbi Yehuda Poter b'Mayim, because Mayim is Elam Mamich, therefore it's not going to be Ma'akiv the Holoch of the Isa in terms of its Tchum. Gemara says Mayim in Melech Lo, but Tanya, we have a price Rabbi Yehuda Omer Melech Mayim U Melech Bein be'Isa Bein be'Kedera. So you're allowed to be Molech the Isa and the Kedera Keragli Balas ba'Isa Kedera. And here Rabbi Yehuda applies that even to Melech. Lo kasha, Haba Melech Stomitz, Haba Melech is Terokis. There's some sort of a Melech that's very thick, it's gas, it's Nikar in the Tarovis, and therefore it's not Batel, as opposed to Melech Stomitz, which is very thin, it's not Nikar in the Isa, and therefore it's Batel. So Gemara raises the following objection. Tanya, didn't we learn in a Beitza that Rabbi Yehuda Omer Melech Mayim umelech b'telim be'is, be'en b'telim b'kedera b'nei rutva. But since a kedera has rot, which is nikar to the ayin, you can see it. Therefore, there's no din of bittul berov, and that's difficult on our Mishnah. It seems to contradict our Mishnah because Rabbi Yehuda Poter b'Mayim, which means bein be'isa bein b'kedera. Our Mishnah is talking about both Isa and kedera. And yet our Mishnah mentions Tavlin, which is certainly a davar regularly nosei b'kedera of a lo b'isa. So from our Mishnah, we have a contradiction to the Bryce, because the Bryce said, established that only in an Isa, Rabbi Yehuda holds that Mayim and Melech are b'telim. But in the case of kedera lo b'telim, and the Gemara answers lo kash, ava ava ha beraka. Our Mishnah is talking according to Rabbi Yehuda Mayim b'telim in both an Isa and a Kedera, because we're talking about Ava, it's a very thick tavshil, and the rotav is not Nika. And therefore the din of the Isa in the Mayim is that it's Bat. Mayim is Bat on the Isa, Ha, but the Brisa, in which Rabbi Yehuda said that Melech and Mayim are B'Tela B'Isa, not in a Kedera, that's a case of a tavshil rach, very rotav is Nikar, and therefore the Mayim is not Bat. And this leads us to the Mishnah, which is tomorrow. Thank you very much. Take this opportunity with you